Thank you everybody for coming. Before we begin the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our knowledge, teaching, learning and research practices within the university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. So thank you. Welcome to Rare Brews in Conversation. My name is Matthew Davis. I'm an Associate Director with the library, but on the side I'm also an enthusiastic home brewer. It was with much pleasure that I welcome today our wonderful guest Topher Boehm of Wildflower Brewing and Blending.
Thank you.
Texan by birth, Topher joins us today as a Sydney University alumni, graduating in physics and the history and philosophy of science. It was during university that Topher first started brewing, putting into practice the scientific processes by which he learned to refine the art of brewing for precision and consistency in production. He has been working in commercial breweries since 2013, firstly at Flat Rock Brew Cafe and Batch Brewing Company. Topher began to explore native yeast in 2014, which sparked a new period of learning and discovery and experimentation, which saw him travelling to northern France and Belgium in 2015, where he interned at Brasserie Thierry, and later he travelled to Partisan Brewing in London and Jester King in Texas. In March 2017, Topher, with his brother-in-law and business partner Chris, opened Wildflower Brewing and Blending in Barrackville. So thank you for coming today, Topher.
No worries, thank you. I have to say, just quickly before we start, this feels like really high-tech when we're talking about something that's so low-tech, like old world brewing, all the speakers and things like that. So anyway, but no, thanks for having me. Yeah.
So I'd just like to start off. Now you describe your brewery specialising in farmhouse ales. Would you be able to describe what a farmhouse ale is?
Sure.
And what it is that makes Wildflower unique?
Yeah. We were talking about this before. I generally, farmhouse ales or farmhouse beers are sort of subcategory of the beer sort of world. You might have lagers and English ale brewing. Farmhouse ales generally, just as an explanation, are this category of beers that's a little loose, it's a little rustic. They're beers that are brewed for purpose rather than for precision. However, I don't call my brewery a farmhouse brewery because people sort of associate that with the beers that we do brew, but I'm squarely focused in directly the flight path of Marrickville. There are no cows surrounding me. I don't grow any of my own barley, unfortunately. I certainly don't grow my hops. Yeah, and there are people that are doing that. There are people that are out there now doing modern day representations of some of the beer practices that we're talking about. Holistically, my focus in terms of the exhibit and what we're talking about today is probably more on the yeast perspective because of my use of natural or wild indigenous yeast in our beer. But there are also people out there who are growing their own barley, malting it, growing their own hops. There's an estate ale being made in Tasmania right now by a brewery called Van Diemen. He hasn't released it yet because these beers age for a very, very long time. But I feel like calling myself a farmhouse brewery or farmhouse brewery kind of isn't right when there's people that are taking, that are truly farmers as well. So I don't really call it that. I think I would just call them like yeast-driven, Franco-Belgian old world ales. That's a little bit longer. It's a bit of a mouthful. But
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that's farmers brewing and yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about yeast in a moment, but so you've talked before that your focus on brewing has shifted away from wort creation, which where a lot of brewing is at the moment, to yeast as the main star of your brewery. So can you talk a little bit about the yeast you use, how you came about them, and how they feature in the flavour profile of your beers?
Sure, yeah. I'll just start by separating the sort of process of brewing. Wort production is the process that people generally might associate with brewing. It's where you're mashing, or you're converting sugars from malted barley into a sort of liquid, dextrinous, sugary wort. That then wort is unfermented beer, W-O-R-T, and then you boil it and you add your hops. It's great for photos because there's steam in people's faces and it's really marketing sexy. It takes about 8 hours to brew a good batch of beer. And that's the wort production. When you finish that day, Matthew was just doing a brewing expedition upstairs. When you finish that, you've only sort of just started the first part of the whole brewing process. So after you make wort, you need to ferment it with yeast. And so what we've done at Wildflower is separate those two aspects. Traditional breweries and majority of breweries would have a brew house where they make their wort, and then they also have their fermentation cellar where they conduct the different fermentations. We, on the other hand, only have a fermentation cellar. In Marrickville, there's a number of breweries just surrounding us, so we sort of share the resources and their capabilities and just buy time on their brew houses for them to produce it. The other part, there's a few reasons why we do that. One is financially, it wouldn't have worked to age our beer for as long as we do, as well as purchase the brew house. But also it keeps me not focused on wort production, and this is what we're talking about. Basically, I focus entirely on fermentation. So by the time that wort gets to me, it's already been brewed. I don't have to worry about cleaning the tanks or what's happened there. They're my recipes that they brew for me. But that way, when it comes to me, my focus is directly on fermentations, which is where I think the majority of the flavor in beer comes from. The reason,
So maybe if you want to talk a bit about your yeast, which I believe is quite unique and special.
Yeah, so and specifically, I think for the talk today, I travel to these different breweries and learn these old world traditions of being able, or techniques of utilizing yeast that's naturally occurring, yeast that's captured or harvested or foraged, which is a very sexy marketing word in the food world, foraged from the wild, and use them to ferment the beer. So our house culture is not a monoculture. It's a mixed culture. There's different strains of yeast. There's different types of organisms that are at work there. There's Saccharomyces yeast. There's Brettanomyces yeast. There's Lactobacillus, which is lactic acid producing bacteria you find in sourdough and yogurt. All of these things work together to create a really diverse, interesting flavor. Converse, I mean, you can sort of pinpoint that against traditional brewing, or what most people do now. Traditional as of 1890. I mean, I don't know if Emil Christiansen's books is on display out there, but the first monoculture fermentation was in the 1890s at the Carlsberg Brewery. So when I say traditional, being monoculture is really only 130 years. Most beer being made is a monoculture fermentation. So it's a single strain of yeast, of a Saccharomyces strain. There might be millions and billions and trillions of these yeasts, but this one strain works solely to do the fermentations. Those beers are consistent, they're predictable, and they generally have these sort of clean characteristics. Like you mentioned in the introduction, I just fell in love with the nuance of mixed culture fermentation. I fell in love with the sense of place that you can get from brewing with yeast that's actually harvested from the area that you're brewing in. People talk about local things and local food and all of these kinds of things. And in beer, we can basically order yeast from a yeast lab in France or in America and have it sent out and make that beer. I could make the exact same beer if I was back home in Texas, basically, that I could here with the access to ingredients that we have, and it just didn't seem right for me to move halfway across the world, start my industry and my craft, and be able to do the exact same thing in the place where I grew up. So that's why we focus on it. I mean, Matt's had the beers. It creates hugely different variations of flavor, but also it means something else as well.
Your yeast is specifically cultivated from the New South Wales region, is that right?
Yeah, so the wild yeast aspect to it. So we have in the mixed culture there is a strain that originates from Belgium. We've had it in our brewery for a while, but all of the wild yeast, so there's basically one strain of this Belgian culture, and everything else is from New South Wales. Yeah. So I cultivated yeast off of sugar sources found in the wild. So yeast needs sugar to survive. So anywhere you have sugar in the wild, you will probably also find yeast. And so we cultivated off of fruit, off of flowers, and then from traditional spontaneous fermentations by leaving unfermented beer out, exposed to the overnight air, and allowing things to fall in, and that to start the fermentation. So we cultivated off these things and then just tested with them. It generally, not always does it create a good capture, a good beer, but sometimes it does, and that's when it's fun to use. Looking through some of the books before, when I came in, it was 1 month ago, I guess, there were these sort of really vague descriptions as to how to collect yeast, like where to get a yeast cake from, and it's very, very vague. And so it's pretty, before anyone Christian Hansen 130 years ago, you can imagine people would have had to cultivate yeast from somewhere, and so I don't know, maybe they got it from a baker, they got it from a friend who's a brewer down the road, but they had to start using it somehow. And
I think a lot of the recipes talk about making yeast cake from flour and water that they then left out overnight on a windowsill or somewhere just till it starts to bubble. Yeah. And then you would add that to your wort to start the fermentation.
Yeah, which, I mean, there are beers being made around the world, very small batches of sort of collaborations between brewers and sourdough bakers, where people take the sourdough culture and pitch it into their beer, their wort rather, because it's unfermented, and it will make a beer. I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating.
Our exhibition is a story of brewing as it transformed from a domestic activity into a sort of scientifically controlled large-scale industry. In some ways, you've taken the opposite journey. Can you describe how the change in direction came about, and what does this mean in terms of your approach to brewing, like the philosophy and the practice?
Yeah, there's a lot tied up in that question, to be honest. Firstly, I mean, I never brewed on a very, very large scale. But batch might be known around Marrickville, but it's not a national brand by any means. But certainly an analytical approach that then changed. I've actually thought about this before, because just from my own perspective, I think one of the reasons that I switched was it was not. So this monoculture brewing wasn't very interesting to me anymore. When you're putting the same inputs in and you're getting the same beer every single time, you've successfully created beer and you've successfully replicated that over and over and over again. And at some stage, for me, I'm really fidgety, and I didn't want that anymore. I wanted there to be a certain amount of unpredictability. As well as the fact that I've always had, I mean, I studied physics, but I took the least amount of math classes that I could and did history and philosophy of science, and then some arts classes as well. Because, I mean, I sort of like, I throw clay or throw pottery, things like I've always had this sort of other side to me outside of the analytical point. And this style of brewing, this sort of old world, Franco-Belgian, or working with wild yeast approach, allowed for both of those things to happen in harmony. So still there's an analytical scientific approach to how I have to work with mixed culture yeast. I mean, it's not all shooting from the hip. But then also there is a point where you have to give the yeast your wort, and you just have to trust it, and you have to work with Brother Nature instead of mastering it. There's a great Belgian producer called Kenzion, and Jean Francois is the producer there, the brewer, and he'll always correct someone if they call him a brewmaster, and he's like, no one masters this. Like, what he does is his lambics with spontaneous fermentation. You enter into a partnership with nature. You're not engineering or domineering her at all, and that was, I liked that.
Some of the recipes in the exhibition and competition go back as far as the 18th century. And one thing we discovered when we were trying to convert these into modern brewing recipes was the surprising lack of detail on the types of ingredients. Malt was malt, yeast was yeast, and hops were hops. That's all the description you got. We know that certain malts couldn't possibly have been used. For example, brown malt was heavily used back then, but we know that it has low diastatic power, which is the ability for the enzymes to convert the starches into sugar. So it must have used another type of power malt in there as well. So there must have been local knowledge that was commonplace but felt so unnecessary that it wasn't needed to be written down. You mentioned on your website that much of your time in northern France and Belgium and Wallonia was spent learning the old ways and the forgotten techniques from before pure yeast strains and monoculture. So how much of the brewing you learnt was an oral tradition only, and what were the more interesting things that you discovered that really surprised you in their techniques?
Yeah, no, I'll get to should unpack that a little bit and explain that to a lot of us, malt is malt, and hops are hops, and yeast, and water is water. But there's specifically with the sort of boom of the craft beer industry, different varietals of barley or different varietals of hops have become more famous for their flavors than others, and so you basically have a branding of it's not basically, it is a branding of these certain U.S. Cascade versus Australian Cascade. And so there's this disconnect now between being able to precisely shop for hop harvest and varietal than used to be, and this is different than a great varietal variation. These are Mosaic and Centennial are closer than Tempranillo and Shiraz. Just as a explanation, the part we were asking about the oral tradition. It was funny. I was just saying before we came in, I feel like a bit of a farce because I've started brewing in 2013 commercially. This hasn't been that long of a journey for me, and I hope to continue this for a lot longer. But I'm by no means an expert, and the reason I don't feel like an expert is because a lot of the things that I have learned aren't written down in beautiful old books, and I don't know why we have this association with oral tradition or oral knowledge not being as valid, I guess, as something that's gone through the scientific process or something, I don't know, or written down by someone that we trust. But yeah, a lot of it was, a lot of times, having one day with a producer like a Brews de Belgian, which is another one very, very close to Thierry, and talking to them just for a few hours about how they manage their yeast in a fermentation was probably is a more than two books worth of information that you can sort of deconstruct and decompact and ask questions about either way. So the types of information that I pulled out of those, specifically the oral traditions, or the sort of just continuation or of practice, in France was mostly about yeast health and handling of yeast. The French don't. The French and Belgians don't. Well, the ones that I was working with didn't handle their yeast so sterilely as we would in a large lager or production brewery. That's not to say that they were unclean. It's just that they really saw their yeast as a living product rather than just a base ingredient that they put in. So there was a frame, like a mindset difference, as well as a sort of practicing difference. Along from that, in France and Belgium, was an approach that was different. These people were producing, and this is sort of less tactile than the ingredients, but they were brewing because that was their job, and then they went home and they looked after their family, and they've been doing this for for generations in the family. It wasn't this Instagram marketing craft beer sort of thing that we have now. It was just what they did.
It's just a trade.
It was just a trade. And that was probably more influential, talking about that and understanding brewing as a process that fed the community, or well, fed in a way, I guess, as well, with nutrition and barley. But it's something that they provided just as much as the person down the road running the pharmacy provided the community, and that was really, really interesting. In Texas, back at Jester King. Sorry to take this really long, but the oral traditions there were practiced. I mean, it's a new brewery. Jester King was only 2009, I think, or something like that. They started, and they've been experimenting with things that they've been told and trying to create best practice with a modern viewpoint on old world techniques. Jester King also ferments with mixed culture fermentations. And so it was both of us just kind of looking at each other and working with these brewers going, why do you do that? And they said, I don't know, it just works, and okay, well, let's do that then for a while, or me questioning them and saying, why did you do this? Like, oh, someone told us to do it this way, and then, some producer from Belgium told them that, and so there's a lot of, the community of people that practice these types of fermentations is pretty small. We all talk, yeah.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting to hear some of those things that you talk about, because whenever we read these recipes, there were all these sort of practices that you can't understand quite why they did it. But obviously it had some effect either for preserving the wort before it went to before it was boiled. So, for example, we have some recipes where people recommended boiling hops in the water that you then plan to mash with. You had people who added ginger to the mash, which obviously must have had some sort of preservative.
Yeah.
So these are things that we're not quite sure why they happen.
It probably just worked.
The same with the old before we understood yeast.
Yeah.
So you use the same brew paddle to stir your.
Yeah. The Scandinavian countries have these beautiful sort of lattice-like wooden necklaces almost. They would drop into beer, fermenting beer, and then drop into their next one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So many amazing stuff like that. Yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit about the role of women in brewing.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand the irony of two men sitting here talking about the role of women.
Yeah.
But before the end of the 19th century, before brewing embraced the scientific process, it was largely seen as a sort of a domestic activity. So women's work, in the same way that producing food for the house was a domestic activity. And women often supplemented their household income by selling surplus beer. Now, gradually, as brewing became more commercialised, the role of women in brewing diminished. In a similar way, beer was beginning to be seen as man's work and also as a man's drink. Now, with the craft beer industry, we are seeing a considerable rise in the number of women who make up the market share for beer in Australia and around the world. And I was wondering what your observations were on this and how wildflower brewing fits in.
Sure. Yeah, and women aren't only making up the market share, they're making up the employment side as well. I mean, we're very lucky as an industry to be attracting really great talent that also happen to be women. Anyway, it's interesting, and I think that approach I was talking about that we learned that I was learning about in Belgium, looking at this as a trade or as something that we do just because it is what it is. I think that approach is probably what influenced me most in understanding beer as well. That's something we'll talk about a little bit later, I'm sure, as a preservation technique. And so it did make me think about this industrialization, taking these practices out of homes and into factories and taking them away from, splitting up the genders in terms of who's doing them. And then as we continue, this is something I was thinking about when we were starting the brewery. I mean, if you look at the growth or the sort of development of beer marketing, specifically from basically the 30s and 40s onward, it was so heavily made to be such a man's drink. It's really, really funny because that's not what beer is, and I don't think that beer needs to be something that's only allowed is only enjoyed by one half of the population. Along with that, so along comes craft beer, and some of those breweries and some of the beer that has been being made is far more gender neutral. Not only in the marketing, there's some pretty horrendous marketing out there as well, but there is generally a better sense of marketing from the beer side, but also from the brewery side, but also from the base products as well, being sort of more interesting flavors. And at Wildflower, one of the things that I saw happening in the craft beer industry that I think what we do, I guess, in order to take this into perspective, one of the things that I saw was there's a lot of beers being made out there that are just really over and aggressive. Think about like triply hopped IPAs or hugely boozy Russian Imperial stouts. I don't find those beers all that attractive. I don't like eating food with them because they ruin my palate. And I mean, my wife pointed out to me first. She said, like, I'll never get close to that. Like, it's just so offensive. Yeah. It's so aggressive. It's so overt. And so what we attempt to do at my brewery, and this is along with the wild yeast, is express a lot of flavor without it being demonstrative. And so I think what we do is we attempt to make beer that is subtle and nuanced and has balance and has length. Because my wife's palate's a lot better than mine, and I actually generally all of my friends who are women or my family are women, they have far better palates than I do. They search for more in a drink than a male, and I like to think about someone tasting my beer and then by the time they finish that glass or that bottle, tasting something entirely different because the whole beer is developed. And I think that's what we're really after. I mean, you're right. It's so ironic for two men to be sitting here talking about this, and we do these tours at the brewery, and I talk about how this was a really important part to me in making the beer that we do. This idea of being it's just a bit more androgynous in terms of how we make the beer and how we do it. But I've also know that it can be this kind of like mansplaining thing, even if. Anyway, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
It is.
Yeah.
I have to say, my wife is my barometer for whether or not my beer is any good. She's come up with a whole new lexicon of descriptive words. So, good year and is one of hers. So
do you get those in your mosaic hop IPAs?
It tastes a little bit rubbery. It's a good year.
Yeah.
So one of the images we have in the exhibit, which we've got up there, is the Hogarth's Gin Lane and Beer Street from 1751. Now these images strive to demonstrate the virtues of beer, a relatively low alcohol drink compared with that of gin, which was recently introduced to England after William of Orange occupied the British throne. So gin was cheap because it was made with low quality barley that was unfit for beer production and therefore drunk in quantity by the poor, leading to much angst over the drunkenness and health issues occurring within that population. What has been your experience during your travels with the traditions around beer as a staple food item and the role it plays in the house?
Yeah.
I'm thinking, Tor, about your table beer.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So we make a beer at the brewery that we only serve there as well, which is 3% in alcohol. So it's very, very low alcohol beer, and it has, our attempt is to make it full flavored, so it's not, I wouldn't classify it as a mid-strength, even though that's where it falls in terms of alcohol level. That beer comes from a tradition, which is something that I experienced mostly, again, back in France. Brasserie Thierry has a 2.9% table beer that every day during lunch when we were at the brewery, the boil would be going. Hour-long lunch in France, very, very important, cannot be missed. So we'd sit down and we'd drink the table beer during the middle of the workday. And for some reason, it really struck me as like, this is crazy. Like, we're drinking during the day. Like, but you go back to work and you really don't. It's such a low alcohol content. You don't feel it. Maybe a 330 ml bottle of a 2.9% beer might be half a standard drink, maybe. Yeah. So that was my experience with it. Was not only there, but also in Belgium. There's a tradition of table beers being produced for like children at school and stuff like that. And I fell in love with this idea of beer being a purpose drink rather than something that is only for basically imbibing. And that's why we make the beer at the breweries, to kind of bring that tradition a little bit to Australia. Specifically with these two things, I saw these I was at a distillery in London. I saw this the first time. It was called Sipsmith. I'm looking at that gin, yeah. And they were talking to me about it and how this was all propaganda and things like that, which to a large extent it kind of was, but at the same, the beer industry wants to be this thing held on high regard, that's so civilized as compared to Gin Street. But at the same time, I kind of think about it now and think about like if people were brewing beers for sustenance and for beer as a food preservation technique rather than something just be imbibing, versus gin, which isn't. And I have a lot of friends who make gin, so I'm not going to go too far into this. But it's so much higher in alcohol. I mean, it doesn't have the nutrients. Yeah. It's been distilled, so the byproducts of fermentation that are healthy for you, that you might have in beer or primary fermented wine, aren't there. And so I think there's a shred of truth amongst all of this propaganda. But the table beer is interesting in how it's been responded to, at least in the market. When I tell the story and get a chance to explain this product as being something that can be enjoyed and you can still drive and it's not going to taste like water, and where it comes from, people really, really appreciate it. But when you just drop it off at a table or you send it off to a bottle shop and someone buys it, it's quite funny. People think, oh no, I can't have a can't have a 3% beer, a 3% craft beer. No way. Like, there's got to be nothing in that. And I brewed it today. Well, batch brewed it for me today. I think about it as well as being this really non-consumptive product as well. And we use literally half of the amount of malt that I would use in making another one of my beers, a 6% amber ale. We use less hops. So you can imagine if you only had a certain amount of barley to harvest every year, you can't just go buy some from an overseas grower or something like that. Like the economy was localized. Then you would want to get more length out of those ingredients, and so that's another reason why low alcohol beers make sense. And I mean, lastly, we all maybe we have to talk about the water. Well, yeah. Obviously, water being not totally safe to drink. Even with a small amount of malt, a small amount of sugar, a 3% table beer, a low alcohol beer will last a lot longer than boiled water. So it's a more preserved water as well as some small preservation of barley. So there's a lot of use for these things, and I think specifically in Australia with the hot weather, our taxation methods here, I think that they have a great place here. I'm actually really surprised I don't see more of them. But anyway, it's mine.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting that in Eastern Europe there's a lot of tradition around low alcohol drinks like kvass, which is made from sourdough, and it's usually about 1%. Yeah. Which everybody drinks.
It's on the street. There's no building license to spell that. Yeah.
So it's quite interesting to see where that alcohol as a preserving agent and also preventing illness from bad water has a role in this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's my end of my questions. So I was hoping to throw it open to the audience if anyone have any specific questions for Topher. Bradley.
I got one for you, Topher.
Sure.
In the Belgian tradition, hang on. So, I'm just not talking to you. In the Belgian tradition, in the lambic halls and the fermentation halls, they allow other species to come in and take part during fermentation. They generally refer to it as their ecosystem. So we're talking about spiders and mice and cats and everything.
I thought you were talking yeast species. I was like, it's easy.
Yeah, no. Well, apparently there are things going on outside the kegs. I saw a nice photo of you sitting on some really brand new kegs. I was just wondering, are you going to get away with that in Australia, or are you letting it happen, or are you engineering that?
Well, we don't have any tap drinking.
Can I record this?
Yeah, shut off the mic. No, that's interesting. I haven't heard as much about that. I mean, in terms of the larger sort of ecosystems, you hear about those ecosystems in cellars in wine, the mold that grows and things like that. I haven't heard about it as much in beer, but there is certainly environmental influences from everywhere. When we started the brewery, I sprayed all of the timber in the brewery with finished beer that I really liked to inoculate my brewery with the yeast that I wanted it to have. So in a way that the brewery itself is like the physical building is part of our process as well. It's essential now to the flavor of the beer. People that have been making clean, Pilsner Urquell in the Czech Republic used to open ferment their lager until the 1990s. This is lager. This is a pure strain fermentation. But they did it so long in these halls that every tile, everything was so impregnated with that yeast that there was no risk of infection. So it's not surprising to me that anyone talk about that. My wife's pregnant. She has to have a baby in a few weeks, and we were learning. I was learning at some class or something like that about the sort of bacterial baptism that a child gets from you as a parent when they're born. I mean, your bacterial and ecosystem is integral for life of all kinds. So yeah, I mean, I've allowed it, and I encourage it in the sense of spraying down the walls. The beer is made sanitarily, and it will not affect your health. And the health authorities do not need to come look at that yet. It's fine.
Fantastic. Any other questions?
Yeah. Reading some of the older recipes, they seem to be really into adding eggs a lot. I think the last recipe we saw had 6 eggs in the barrel for a year.
Okay.
Have you heard of that being carried forward into modern brewing, or have we dropped the
Maybe
dairy?
as a fining agent? Would
Yeah.
Would you? Yeah.
I think that's what we believe, that it is
Yeah.
the same way you would use Wildflower tablets or isinglass or Irish moss today. They use egg white.
Yeah, so I mean, I can think of a few different things why you might do that. So fining being clarification, so pulling out, like stripping out flocculating any yeast or any other sediment that's sort of around in the beer to drop into the bottom, so that when you rack off of that, you have a clearer beer. However, I actually don't think that they would have been that worried about clarity of their beer at that stage. I think there's probably also some, and this is an absolute shot in the dark, so if anyone is a yeast specialist, please tell me. I reckon there's probably some yeast health things that you could get from eggs, maybe some sort of proteins that might help with haze formation or head formation, or yeast metabolism, maybe continuing a fermentation for longer, just a bit of extra different type of sugar. So I'm not entirely sure. The first idea would be on that. As far as people continuing it, no. I've never done it, and there's sort of we use a isinglass, which Matt was talking about, which is a sort of, or Irish moss. Isinglass is different. We use Irish moss in the kettle, like literally moss, to help pull out any extra sort of proteins that are hazing, that are floating around. So that's interesting. I wanted to look more at that. No, that's 6 eggs in a small thing. That's pretty.
I think
breakfast beer, that one. Yeah.
I think the shell's actually made out of calcium carbonate, so they'd use it as a form of fighting against acidity.
Yeah,
For sure.
Cool.
And there's also, we know that certain minerals are important to yeast health.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of the recipes have raisins added to the fermentation vessel, because it's full of nitrogen and other types of minerals that the yeast feed on. So
My brother makes cider in the States, and there's a traditional American cider with raisins added, which is not only for sugar and nutrients, but dried grapes. Yeast is on the skins of the grapes. So it could also be another source of that yeast. Yeah.
fantastic. Have we got any other questions from the audience? No. Fantastic. Oh, we have one more?
Yeah.
When you were searching for various New South Wales yeasts, were you trying to get any specific sources, like wattle or sort of anything representative of the state, or did you just go anything that starts fermenting when you chuck in the beer?
I intentionally had a great harvest off of wattle blossoms. So yeah, we absolutely did. In terms of flowers, it was mostly native flowers that we would go for. I didn't cut any wildflowers from any national parks or anything like that. There was no sort of nefarious things going on there. But no, I mean, I was interested in using sort of more wildflowers. So, see, in the States we call them wildflowers, which is why the breweries named that. Native things. So Grevillea was also really generous with yeast. Sort of native dandelions. There's some areas I think that are native. No, maybe not native. I don't know. There's some wild dandelions. We're very generous as well. To be honest, I can't remember all the things. We were doing a lot of different batches. I'd have to go through all of my sources of yeast, but and all my sort of documentation. But there certainly were specific places that you would look for yeast, and specific places where you wouldn't. Also, different times of the year lend different sort of a diversity of cultures that you might collect. So in the summertime, for example, you might get some more bad stuff, bacteria that doesn't taste great. That goes dormant in the winter, that you won't collect in the winter, which is primarily, in my opinion, why I think the wattle blossoms were so good. I think it took me about a year to get this culture going and to understand what it was, but I'm not preoccupied with maintaining it exactly the way that it is. We have to accept a certain amount of drift, because the populations within the culture change themselves as well. And so I haven't had a chance to do it this year. I've been really, really busy, but I'll continue to go out and search for things. So if anyone thinks there's an awesome source of yeast that they know of, please tell me, and we'll capture some yeast off of it and see what happens. Yeah.
Fantastic. Any more questions? All right, we might finish it off there. Just before we finish, did you want to mention your collaborative beer that you'll be
Sure,
releasing?
yeah, absolutely. In October, a few months ago, we brewed a beer with a maltster from New South Wales and a hop grower from sort of this far south coast, New South Wales. And we used our yeast and only our indigenous cultures, our native cultures, rather than that Belgian Saison strain that I was talking about wasn't a part of it. And so we've made a beer that, as far as we know, is probably the first modern day representation of an entirely state-driven beer. It uses things only from this state. So it's interesting. It's sitting in a big 500 liter punch-in right now, barrel right now. But I will release that in October. So it's just going to go. It's a fascinating project because it shows a lot of maturity in the industry to be able to support local maltsters, hopsters, and people like me that are sort of crazy working with wild yeast. But anyway, that's going to be a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Topher. Everyone, give a round of applause.
Thank you.
And if you haven't already had a chance to have a look at the exhibition on level 1 in the Rare Books Library, I encourage you to go down and have a look. There's some fantastic pieces down there, and those were just some images from some of the books that are on display there. And I encourage any of you who, if you're interested in brewing, to enter the homebrew competition, which closes on the 24th of September. All entries into Staves Brewery. We're asking people to brew recipes that we've pulled out from those rare books and put online. And there's some great prizes in there. We've got Day as a Brewer at Staves and another brewery. We've got homebrew voucher packs. We've got merchandise packs. Brewery tours. It's fantastic. So if you're interested, get brewing. And thank you very much.